Welcome back and thank you for joining us. This video presentation and the accompanying narration was designed for East Texas Baptist University for use in course Criminal Justice 1311 Fundamentals of Criminal Law. And I am Dr. Eric Hillman. The textbook that we use in this course is Criminal Law, 12th edition by Joel Samaha. The student's viewing of this presentation is designed to supplement the student's reading of the book and not simply to replace it. Chapter 5 is entitled Justification Defenses. I have divided Chapter 5 into several smaller segments for easier viewing by the student. This is Chapter 5C, the third segment of Chapter 5. We need to talk a little bit more about the choice of evils defense. We had talked about it briefly when we talked about prison escape, that it's illegal and therefore criminal to escape from prison, but if a prisoner escapes from the prison because the prison's burning down, he can claim necessity or choice of evils, that the evil of breaking the law to escape from prison was less than the evil of burning to death. The choice of evils defense is also called the necessity defense or the general principle of necessity, aka means also known as. And basically it means that you are forced to commit a lesser evil in order to avoid a greater evil. And there's several examples of this that have happened in the history of our country. One example is a forest fire. When there's a forest fire and that forest fire is threatening houses, cities, towns, people, the fire department will often go out in front of the fire and light a counter fire. So the forest fire itself may be 200 feet in the air and intensely hot. And so what they'll do is they will start a smaller fire, say on the edge of a road. Now, if the fire was 200 feet high, those embers would easily cross, say, a 30-foot wide cement or tarred road and cross the other side. But by lighting a small fire on the same side of the road as the giant fire, that small fire, at least in its beginning stages, won't jump the road, and it may burn all the underbrush back to the big fire. So when the two fires meet up, it's a long ways from the road, it's a long ways from the timber on the other side of the road, and when the two fires meet up, they have used up all the fuel, all the dry timber, and the fire stops. The problem is that when firefighters light counter fires, often some land is burned or maybe even some houses. And so if a firefighter, a fire department is trying to save an entire town, they light a counter fire and that destroys one house or two houses. Well, normally to deliberately burn down a house would be arson, but here the firefighters would argue, if they were charged, and of course under these circumstances they wouldn't be, but if they were charged with arson, they would argue choice of evils, the general principle of necessity. We lit the counterfire, and yes, it burned down someone's house, but it saved an entire town. And that's the general principle of necessity. Probably the most famous case on choice of evils defense, or the necessity defense, is the Queen versus Dudley and Stevens. This is a case from 1800s, 1884 to be exact, and it deals with a shipwreck. A ship sank in the middle of the ocean, long ways between England and America. Prior to Charles Lindbergh flying across the Atlantic around in the 1920s, the only way you had across was to go by ship, and that would sometimes take weeks. Anyway, a ship sank in the middle of the ocean, and the only survivors were two men and a teenager. The teenager was a cabin boy, basically a servant to the captain. So everyone else perished, but they managed to get one lifeboat off the ship, and there's three of them there, two grown men and the teenage boys, and they went without food for many days, so you can imagine they're very hungry and very thirsty. Starving, they finally managed to catch a turtle. A turtle was curious as to what was in the boat, swam up there, and they managed to grab the turtle, and they ate the raw turtle. Well, better than nothing. Several more days went by and no food, no water. They're starving to death. They're thirsting to death. And they said, let's draw lots. It's kind of like throwing dice, but drawing lots, oftentimes they'll have papers or sticks of different lengths, and you can't see what length they are. And one person, maybe blindfolded, chooses one stick to determine who's going to die. And they said, let's draw lots, and that way it'll be fair. Whoever loses, he's the one that gets killed, and the other two eat him. Well, the cabin boy didn't want that, and I think this cabin boy is pretty smart. He knew that these two men were going to rig the contest against him, and he would be the one that would be killed and eaten. So he refused to participate in this game. The next day, there's still nothing to eat, nothing to drink. They feel like they're going to die. And the next day, the two grown men told the cabin boy, well, we have families. We have wives and children at home to take care of. You're just a teenager. You've got no family to take care of. So if one person should die, it should be you. Well, that's one way of looking at it. And that's a handy way of looking at it for these two older men. But perhaps another way to look at it is, hey, we've lived a longer time than you have, and you should, since you're a young teenager, you should be given an opportunity to live many years too. That would be the cabin boy's point of view. But by this point, it looks like these two men have decided on their course of action. The cabin boy knows what's coming, and he doesn't like it. If you can't read the clip art, it says, congratulations, you have been chosen. It's the third person receiving a letter of congratulations, and basically meaning he lost the lot. Finally, they get hungry enough, they just kill him. And they ate him, the cabin boy, the teenage boy. And by eating him, that was food to survive, and his blood was moisture to drink, and they lived 4 more days. And then a rescue ship arrived. Well, when the rescue ship gets there, there's 2 men, perhaps the remains of the boy. So are they guilty of something? Murder? Or is it choice of evils? Is it better for 1 to die than for 3 to die? Well, that was the case that was brought against Stevens. The case against Dudley and Stevens was murder, and they were convicted of murder based on the facts of this case. They appealed, pleading necessity or choice of evils. They said it's better for 1 person to die than for all 3 of us to die. And the appeals court said, well, sometimes you have a duty to preserve your life. Sometimes you have a duty to die for others. And it's commonly taught in military training that you have a duty to die, if need be, for the greater good of your military branch, your group of soldiers or Marines that you're with. So did they have a duty to preserve their life, or did they have a duty to die for others? Should one of the older men have volunteered to let himself be killed so the other 2 could eat him? And really, this is an issue of how do you compare the value of lives? How can you say to the middle-aged man, how can he say, well, I have a wife and kids, so I should live? And how do you value his life over the teenagers? The teenager could, as we said, could say, I have a right to live too, at least as long as you did. So you've already lived more lives than I have. Maybe I should live. And the bottom line is it's impossible to compare the value of lives because each life has value. And what the appeals court said here is basically the strong killed the weak. There wasn't an analysis really of the value of lives. You were stronger than the boy, the teenage boy, and you killed him and ate him. And so both Dudley and Stevens were sentenced to death. So their choice of evil's defense or their necessity defense did not work. Interestingly, after serving about 6 months in prison, awaiting the death sentence, the Queen later commuted their sentence to time served. So it probably means that the Queen was getting a lot of pressure from perhaps the naval industry saying that these men couldn't help it, they had no choice. I don't know, but for some reason she commuted their death sentence to time served at just 6 months, and they walked free. Interesting case. So as we look at choice of evils defense or necessity defense in the modern days, we have to also weigh the values of different choices. It's illegal to speed, but if you had a close relative, maybe your mother, your wife, your child, was dying and you're rushing them to the hospital, do you have a right to speed? If the speed limit is 55 and you're going 80 and you get stopped and they give you a ticket, should you be able to argue necessity? I think we'd all agree that, yeah, a dying child is worth speeding for. What about throwing cargo overboard to lighten a sinking ship? There have been many times when ships have been taking in water or sinking, and they have simply unloaded and dropped valuable cargo into the ocean to make the ship lighter. Same has happened on airplanes. When airplanes have developed engine trouble, maybe there's a 4-engine plane that's down to 1 or 2 engines, and they'll just throw cargo out of the airplane to make it lighter. Is it a good choice of evils? I mean, in both cases, they're throwing out somebody else's valuable property, but we would probably say yes, it was necessary to save human life. That's more important. It was a lesser evil to throw out cargo than it was to lose human life. So I think we'd agree with that. Dispensing drugs without a prescription in emergency. Well, what if your airplane's crashed out in the desert and one of the passengers dies in the airplane crash, but that passenger has some painkillers, Tylenol 3. Is it okay for you to give that Tylenol 3 to another passenger who survived the plane crash but was severely hurt? We would probably all agree in that case it would be okay, even though he didn't have a prescription. What if you're out in the mountains and you get caught in a blizzard? It's burglary to break into a cabin with intent to steal. What if you break in to avoid freezing to death? You're breaking into someone's home or someone's property, but we'd all agree that it's better to break a window on a door than it is for people to freeze to death. What if there's a drug dealer that wants to date your daughter? Is it okay to kill him? Certainly, you don't want a drug dealer dating your daughter. Is it a lesser evil to kill the drug dealer than it is for him to date your daughter? Without any threat of imminent serious bodily injury or death, if you killed the drug dealer, you'd probably be charged with murder and convicted. But we make choices every day. Not all of us are forced into these difficult choices, but we can all see situations where a choice of evil's defense could arise. So let's look at some cases where the choice of evil's defense was argued. U.S. versus Aguilar comes from the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. This is a 1989 case. Aguilar is charged with smuggling Central Americans illegally into the U.S. So in the 1980s, there's civil war going on in Central America, and many Central Americans are coming to the U.S. looking for a better life, trying to escape the war. Aguilar helps get them into the United States, and he's charged with smuggling aliens. He claims choice of evil's defense. Why? Because the refugees' lives were in danger. If they went back to El Salvador, they would have been killed in the war. And they said INS, that's Immigration and Nationalization Service, that is the precursor to ICE. We'd call them ICE now. They were blocking entry. So they couldn't get in the country because ICE was blocking entry. And so, says Aguilar, I helped them. I smuggled them in because if they went back to El Salvador, they'd have been killed in the war. Is that a choice of evils defense? Is it better to smuggle someone in the country and break an immigration law than it is for them to die? Aguilar is arguing. And so the appeals court lays out 4 elements to a choice of evils defense. So these are the elements. And again, not just for me, but for any professor, anytime you see a list of 3 or 4 things, it makes a good multiple choice question. In order to use a choice of evils defense, you've got to show these 4 elements. First, the defendant, in this case Aguilar, was faced with a choice of evils and he chose the lesser evil. So he faced the evil of these Central American refugees being killed versus breaking immigration law. So it would seem that breaking immigration law is the lesser evil. Step 2, he acted to prevent imminent harm. So remember, imminent is the legal word for immediate. The harm has to be coming at him right now. Number 3, he reasonably believed his conduct would stop the harm. Well, by smuggling him in the U.S., is it reasonable to believe that he would stop the harm of them being killed in Central America? Probably. And number 4, that there are no other legal alternatives. Well, were there other legal alternatives to Mr. Aguilar? The court's going to look at these 4 elements and apply them to Mr. Aguilar. And the court focuses on the 4th one, that Mr. Aguilar failed to show there were no other legal alternatives. When someone is denied admission into the United States as a refugee, there is an appeals process. So if you're stopped, you can claim asylum. You can claim, say you want asylum because of a civil war in your country. And if that's denied by INS at the time, or ICE now, you can then appeal their decision to the courts or the judiciary. And so here, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals says Mr. Aguilar failed to show there was no other legal alternatives, and he failed to use any appeal to the judiciary. So he fails on the 4th point of those 4th elements. Here's an interesting case out of Oregon. As you recall, Oregon was one of the first states to legalize marijuana, but this is back in the year 2000, and marijuana is still illegal in Oregon. So Mr. Ownby is charged with possession of marijuana. Not so significant, it happens every day. But he claimed the necessity defense, choice of evils defense. He said, I was a Vietnam War vet, and I have post-traumatic stress disorder. The marijuana helps me get over my PTSD, and therefore, smoking marijuana was the lesser evil, and me suffering a lifetime of post-traumatic stress disorder is the greater evil. So he says, I chose the lesser evil, smoking marijuana. But the Oregon Court of Appeals said the legislature has already looked at this issue. They've weighed the pros and cons of legalizing marijuana, and they decided against it. And we're not going to let you use the choice of evils defense when the legislature has specifically looked at it and specifically made up their mind that we're not going to allow it. So in this case, anyway, of course, this is before Oregon legalized marijuana. They're saying if the legislature's already looked at this issue and already decided against it, we're not going to overturn the legislature. This is kind of an interesting case out of Colorado. Mr. Dover is a lawyer. He has a problem today. He's got 2 cases in 2 different counties on the same day. That would be like a lawyer in Marshall having a case in Harrison County Court in Marshall and in Gregg County Court in Longview on the same day. So he went to one court, took care of business, and then he was driving 80 miles an hour to go to the other court in the other county, and he received a speeding ticket. Well, he could have just paid the ticket, but he decided to argue choice of evils, necessity. He claimed it's better to speed than to miss court. So speeding is a small offense, but is missing in court a a greater offense? So did he commit the lesser offense to avoid the greater offense? Now, why is he making this argument for a simple speeding ticket? This goes all the way to the Colorado Supreme Court. Well, probably because what is he really saying to the judge? He's saying, Judge, it's so important to not miss your court setting that it was worth my while to speed to get here. And he's figuring that the court would probably side with him because he's doing everything he can to get to court. And the court said, well, wait a minute. You failed to show, first of all, there was an emergency. That would be the imminent harm. Secondly, you failed to show evidence of a relative harm for each choice. So he didn't give any evidence on the record for the court that one choice was better or worse than the other. And thirdly, he didn't show that he didn't cause the situation. In other words, if you have two court cases in two different counties on the same day, you can call both courts and see if you can get one reset, see if you can get one for the morning and the other one set for the afternoon, etc. And so maybe this lawyer, just being so lazy that he didn't bother to call both courts or one court to ask permission to be late or get his case reset, meant that he caused the situation. Anyway, he spent time and money going all the way to the Colorado Supreme Court, and he still lost, so he had to pay his traffic ticket. And that's the end of Chapter 5C, the third segment of Chapter 5. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you for the next segment.